At 0900 hours, on July 4th, 1943, there were no parades on Rendova Island. There was only the suffocating heat of the Solomons and the terrifying drone of 32 unsynchronized engines. Above the broken cloud layer, 16 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers were lining up for a textbook run on the 9th Defense Battalion. The Japanese pilots had nicknamed this strip of land Suicide Point, convinced the Marines below were nothing more than stationary targets on a gunnery range. In the mud below, Private First Class Evan Evans and the crew of Battery C were fighting a different kind of war, a war of mathematics. In 1943, the standard kill rate for a heavy anti-aircraft gun against a high-speed bomber was less than 2%. It was a lottery, not a science. But in the next 27 minutes, Evans wouldn't just beat the odds, he would shatter them. When the smoke cleared, the kill ratio would be so impossibly high that Admiral Halsey's headquarters would initially refuse to believe the report, demanding an immediate recount of the wreckage burning in the water. To understand how one gun crew turned a slaughter into a statistical miracle, we have to go back to the moment the radar first blinked. That radar blip represented a dilemma that had plagued anti-aircraft gunners since the first biplane took to the sky in the Great War. But on the morning of July 4th, the math had turned lethal. To the inexperienced eye, shooting down an airplane looks simple. You point the gun, you pull the trigger. In reality, hitting a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber at 12,000 feet with a mechanical cannon is a problem of four-dimensional calculus performed in a mud pit. The target was the first variable in this equation of failure. The G4M Betty wasn't just a bomber. It was a high-speed projectile moving at 270 miles per hour. That translates to nearly 400 feet per second. In the time it takes a human heart to beat once, a Betty bomber has traveled the length of a football field. The Japanese pilots knew this. They flew in tight, disciplined V formations, banking on the fact that by the time an American shell arrived at their altitude, they would be long gone. They were relying on a concept gunners called dead time. And for the first 2 years of the war, dead time was the Japanese Navy's best friend. To understand why, you have to look inside the brain of the American defense, the Sperry M4 Director. This wasn't a digital computer. It was a 600-pound box of brass gears, spinning cams, and optical mirrors. It was a clockwork brain designed to predict the future. The theory was elegant. 3 operators looked through telescopes on the Director, tracking the enemy plane's elevation and azimuth. As they cranked their hand wheels to keep the crosshairs on the pilot's cockpit, the internal gears spun, calculating the aircraft's speed and course. The Director would then send an electrical signal to the gun, moving the massive barrel automatically to aim at a patch of empty sky miles ahead of the bomber, the intercept point. But the system had a fatal, mechanical flaw. It assumed the target was a cooperative participant in its own destruction. The Sperry M4 needed a steady track of at least 10 to 15 seconds to generate a smooth firing solution. It needed the bomber to fly in a straight line, at a constant speed, like a civilian airliner. But Japanese pilots didn't fly like airliners. They jinked. They changed altitude. They rode the turbulence. And then there was the fuse. This is the detail that separates the Hollywood version of war from the gritty mechanics of 1943. The script you might have heard claims Evans was using variable time or proximity, fuses miraculous shells that contain tiny radars to detonate automatically when they got close to a target. That is incorrect. In July 1943, those top-secret shells were still restricted almost exclusively to the Navy's fleet to prevent duds from falling into enemy hands. The Marines on Rendova were doing it the hard way, with mechanical time fuses. Before a 90mm shell could be fired, the tip had to be physically twisted to set a timer. The Director sent a signal to a machine on the gun mount called the fuse setter. The loader shoved the 42-pound shell into the setter. The machine cut the time, say, 12.4 seconds, and then the loader had to pull it out, throw it into the breech, and fire. This created the dead time. From the moment the math was solved and the fuse was cut, to the moment the shell actually left the barrel, 3 to 4 seconds would vanish. Add another 12 seconds of flight time for the shell to climb to altitude, and you are working with data that is nearly 20 seconds old. In 20 seconds, a Betty bomber has moved 1.5 miles. If the pilot changes his heading by just 2 degrees or drops his nose slightly, that expensive, high-explosive shell bursts harmlessly in the empty air where the plane used to be. This lag was why standard anti-aircraft doctrine was based on deterrence, not destruction. The goal wasn't necessarily to snipe individual planes, it was to put up a box barrage, a wall of flak so dense that the enemy would be forced to turn away or drop their bombs early. A 2% hit rate was acceptable because the primary mission was just to ruin the bombardier's aim. But for the Marines on Rendova, deterrence wasn't an option. They weren't just guarding a supply dump, they were the shield for the invasion sword. Dug in behind Evans' gun pit were the massive 155mm long tom artillery pieces. These guns were the only things capable of reaching across the Blanche Channel to pound the Japanese airfield at Munda. The long toms were deafening, immobile beasts, completely vulnerable to air attack. If the bombers got through, the artillery would be silenced. If the artillery fell silent, the Marines fighting in the jungles of New Georgia would lose their fire support. Private First Class Evans knew the stakes. He also knew the limitations of his equipment. He could feel the frustration in the hand cranks. The Japanese formation was closing at 4 miles per minute. The Sperry Director was clicking and whirring, trying to spit out a solution, but the dead time hung over the gun pit like a curse. The standard procedure was to follow the pointers to do exactly what the machine said. But Evans and his crew realized that if they played by the book, they would lose. The machine was too slow. The enemy was too fast. To survive the next 27 minutes, they would have to stop acting like operators of a machine and start acting like parts of it. They needed to close the gap between the gear and the gut. They needed a solution that wasn't in the manual, a way to erase the dead time through sheer, suicidal speed. Speed, in the manual of the 90mm M1 anti-aircraft gun, was a regulated concept. The official doctrine stated that a well-trained crew should sustain a rate of fire of perhaps 15 rounds per minute, one shot every 4 seconds. But Private First Class Evan Evans, a 22-year-old from Richmond, Indiana, looked at the 9-ton weapon and saw inefficiency. Evans wasn't a career tactician. He was a machinist at heart. He understood that in a manufacturing plant, a 3-second delay on the assembly line costs money. In the Solomons, a 3-second delay cost lives. This is where the legend of Rendova often drifts into fiction. You will hear stories claiming Evans and his battery achieved their miracle using the top-secret VT or variable time fuse, a revolutionary shell with a tiny radio transceiver that detonated automatically when it sensed a plane. That would make this a story about superior American technology, a magic bullet that solved the problem. But the truth is far grittier. On July 4th, 1943, the VT fuse was effectively a ghost in the Pacific Theater, hoarded by the Navy for the open ocean to prevent duds from being captured and reverse-engineered by the enemy. Evans didn't have a smart shell. He had the standard Mark 18 high-explosive round with a mechanical M43 time fuse. He didn't have a microchip. He had a clock that had to be wound by hand in the middle of a firefight. This lack of technology meant that the only variable capable of change was the flesh and blood operating the gun. To hit a target moving at 400 feet per second, the dead time, the lag between the computer's decision and the gun's firing had to be reduced to near zero. Evans realized that the Sperry Director wasn't the bottleneck. The crew was. The solution was to turn the gun crew into a single, biological piston. They called it the loop. It required a level of physical intimacy and trust that bordered on insanity. On gun number 3, the roles were divided with surgical precision. There was the trayman, who pulled the 42-pound complete round from the ready rack. There was the fuse setter, who jammed the nose of the shell into the automated cutter on the gun mount. And there was the rammer, often the strongest man on the crew, whose sole job was to punch the round into the breech with enough force to trip the closing block. In a standard drill, these movements are distinct. Lift, pause, set, pause, load, pause, fire. Evans and his crew erased the pauses. They overlapped the movements. As the trayman swung the heavy shell toward the setter, the fuse setter was already moving the cutting lever. As the shell came out of the setter, the rammer's arm was already traveling forward, trusting that the shell would be there when his fist arrived. If anyone hesitated, a hand would be crushed in the breech, or a live shell would be dropped on the concrete deck. It was a dance performed with high explosives, transforming the crew into a human servo mechanism. This rhythm did something critical. It synced the gun to the radar. By maintaining a furious, uninterrupted cadence, pushing the rate of fire closer to 25 rounds per minute, They allowed the Sperry Director to feed continuous corrections to the fuse setter without the data going stale. They weren't just shooting faster, they were shooting fresher data. But this innovation came with a physical cost. A 90mm shell weighs roughly the same as a large bag of cement. Moving 25 of them in a minute is back-breaking labor. Moving them in the tropical heat of Rendova, where the humidity turned the air into soup and the mud sucked at your boots, was torture. The crew wasn't just fighting the Japanese. They were fighting exhaustion, slippery sweat, and the deafening concussion of their own weapon. And on the morning of July 4th, they didn't have time to warm up. The radar operators on the SCR-268 sets were already screaming out ranges. The dead time was ticking away. Evans looked at his crew, Boone, Gamborowski, and the others. They were stripped to the waist, covered in grease and mud, standing in a pit that was about to become the loudest place on Earth. The Japanese were 4 minutes out. The manual said they should fire defensively. Evans intended to fire for effect. The human servo was primed. The gears were engaged. All they needed now was the target. But the target was approaching a position that was already under siege by the Earth itself. Rendova Island in July was not a military base. It was a festering, flooded swamp that seemed chemically designed to destroy mechanical precision. Since landing on June 30th, the 9th Defense Battalion had been living in a slurry of mud, oil, and rotting vegetation. The rain didn't fall. It hammered, turning foxholes into cisterns and coating the delicate optical lenses of the fire control directors with a persistent film of condensation. For the men of Battery C, the enemy wasn't just the Japanese Navy. It was the microscopic violence of the jungle. Jungle rot ate at their feet inside wet boots, and the 80s mosquito carried dengue fever, bone break fever, which could turn a healthy loader into a shivering invalid in 12 hours. Yet, in this biological soup, they had to maintain the tolerances of a Swiss watch. The 90mm guns required spotless breeches to cycle at high speed, but the real casualty of the climate was the radar. The SCR-268 radar sets were the eyes of the battalion, but in 1943, radar was a fragile stack of vacuum tubes and copper wiring. The humid, salt-heavy air of the Solomons corroded connections and rotted the insulation off high-voltage cables. A radar set that worked perfectly at dusk might be blind by dawn because a single tube socket had oxidized. The operators spent their nights fighting entropy, drying components with light bulbs and praying the pip on the oscilloscope would stabilize. Without those green flickering lines, Evans and his gun crew were blind, reduced to aiming with iron sights against bombers hiding in the clouds. And they had to see, because what they were guarding was the juggernaut of the American offensive. 50 yards behind Evans' gun pit, the earth shook with a different kind of thunder. These were the 155mm long tom guns of the Army's 168th Field Artillery. These massive weapons were the entire reason the Marines were on this miserable island. Across the narrow Blanche Channel, less than 5 miles away, lay the Japanese airfield at Munda on New Georgia. The long toms were pounding Munda 24 hours a day, their shells screaming over the heads of the Marine anti-aircraft crews. The arrangement was simple and terrifying. The Army artillery was the hammer destroying the Japanese base, and Evans' 90mm gun was the shield. The Japanese knew that to save Munda, they had to kill the long toms. And to kill the long toms, they had to fly directly over Rendova. The Japanese commanders at Rabaul called this destination Suicide Point. But in a twist of dark irony, they didn't mean it was suicide for them. They meant it was suicide for the Marines. The Japanese Naval Air Service had studied the American positions. They knew Rendova was a static, crowded beachhead. They knew the radar was struggling. And they knew that historically, American anti-aircraft fire was sound and fury, signifying nothing. They regarded the 9th Defense Battalion not as a threat, but as a speed bump. This arrogance was built on experience. For 18 months, Japanese Betty bombers had flown through American flak with relative impunity. Their pilots were veterans of China and the early Pacific campaigns, flying aircraft that stripped away armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to gain speed and range. They prioritized offense over survival, believing that their speed and formation discipline were the only armor they needed. They looked down at the mud-soaked island and saw a chaotic construction site, unaware that inside the chaos, a trap was being set. On the morning of July 4th, the rain finally stopped, leaving the air heavy and still. The silence was deceptive. Inside the command post, the radio crackled. The SCR-268, patched together with salvage parts and sleepless determination, had picked up a contact. It wasn't a ghost signal. It was a solid formation, inbound from the northwest, flying down the slot. The warning siren began its low, rising wail, cutting through the humidity. On gun number 3, the exhaustion vanished, replaced by the cold clarity of adrenaline. Evans checked the breech. It was clean. The fuse setter was calibrated. The human servo shook off the fatigue of the jungle. They were about to find out if their clockwork rhythm could beat the finest air fleet in the Pacific, or if the Japanese were right to call this place a graveyard. The long toms fell silent. The stage belonged to the 90 seconds. The waiting was over. The waiting ended not with a bang, but with a synchronized mechanical scream. At 9:15, the 16 Mitsubishi G4M bombers materialized out of the haze. 16 dark crosses etched against the cloud ceiling at 12,000 feet. They were flying in a tight, arrogant V formation, the pilots holding their course steady, waiting for the predictable, scattered black puffs of American flak that they could easily navigate through. They expected a chaotic fireworks display. Instead, they flew into a buzzsaw. On gun number 3, the world narrowed down to a 3-second loop of violent choreography. Evans and his crew ceased to be individuals. They became the biological extension of the M1 gun. The rhythm was hypnotic and terrifying. Thud, the shell hit the tray. Whir, click, the fuse setter cut the time to 12.8 seconds. Slam, the rammer punched the round into the breech. Crack, the 9-ton gun convulsed, hurling a 24-pound package of TNT into the stratosphere at 2,800 feet per second. There was no time to watch the sky. There was only the breech block opening, the smoking brass casing clattering to the deck, and the next round already moving into position. The human servo was running at redline. By sustaining a rate of fire that approached 25 rounds per minute, Evans and the other crews on Rendova were doing something the Japanese had never encountered. They were feeding the Sperry Directors fresh data faster than the pilots could react. The dead time was dissolving. The result was catastrophic for the Japanese. The first volley of 90mm shells didn't burst hundreds of yards behind the formation. They detonated squarely inside the flight path. The lead Betty bomber flew directly into a curtain of high-velocity shrapnel. This is where the Japanese design philosophy betrayed them. The G4M Betty was built for range and speed, sacrificing armor to save weight. Crucially, the massive fuel tanks inside its wings were not self-sealing. They were rubber bags filled with high-octane aviation gas. Allied pilots called the Betty the Type 1 lighter, or the Flying Zippo, because it didn't just crash, it incinerated. The lead bomber didn't spiral. It simply ceased to exist as an aircraft and became a falling comet of burning magnesium and aluminum. The right wing folded, the fuel tanks ruptured, and a fireball the size of a city block bloomed over the channel. Usually, seeing the flight leader vanish would cause a formation to break, but the Japanese discipline held for exactly 30 seconds, just long enough for the next salvo to arrive. Evans' crew was now locked in a trance state. The barrel of the gun was glowing dull red. The heat radiating from the breech was so intense it singed the hair on their arms, and the paint on the recoil cylinders was bubbling and peeling off in sheets. But the rhythm didn't break. Load, ram, set, fire. The second bomber took a direct hit to the fuselage. It disintegrated. The third lost its tail section and began a flat, sickening spin toward the water. In the sky above, panic finally set in. The V formation shattered. The remaining pilots, realizing that the safe altitude of 12,000 feet was actually a kill zone, did the only thing they could. They broke formation and dived, trying to get under the radar. It was a fatal mistake. By scattering, they lost the mutual protection of their defensive machine guns. By diving, they brought themselves closer to the guns. The engagement shifted from a barrage to a turkey shoot. The Sperry Directors, designed to track single targets, were now spoiled for choice. The operators spun their hand wheels, tracking the desperate bombers as they tried to run for the open ocean. Evans' gun swung smoothly to the left, chasing a Betty that was trailing smoke. The fuse setter whirred shorter time now, 8 seconds. The gun roared. The shell burst directly under the bomber's belly, flipping it inverted. It hit the water seconds later, exploding on impact. For 27 minutes, the noise was continuous, a symphony of percussion that shook the filling out of teeth. The pile of spent brass casings on the deck of Battery C grew until the men were slipping on them. The air in the pit was unbreathable, a toxic mix of cordite smoke and vaporized oil. But the guns didn't stop until the radar screen was clear. When the ceasefire order finally came at 9:42, the silence was heavier than the noise. The sky was empty. The channel was not. The water between Rendova and New Georgia was littered with the burning pyres of what had been the pride of the Rebel air wing. Oil slicks spread across the surface, mixed with debris and the wreckage of wings bearing the red Hinomaru sun. Evans stepped back from the gun, his chest heaving, his ears ringing with a tinnitus that would never fully go away. He looked at the breach. It was still smoking. They had fired dozens of rounds, moving tons of ordnance with their bare hands. They were dehydrated, deafened, and shaking from adrenaline withdrawal. But as they looked out over the channel, the math was undeniable. 16 bombers had attacked. Only 4 were limping away, and 2 of those were so badly damaged they would likely ditch before reaching base. 12 aircraft were confirmed destroyed. In less than half an hour, a single Marine battalion, fighting from a swamp with inferior mechanical computers, had wiped out an entire squadron. The Japanese had come to Suicide Point expecting a massacre. They found one, but they were the victims. The survivors at Rebel would have to explain to their commanders why the Americans were suddenly shooting with the accuracy of snipers. The survivors at Rebel would have to explain to their commanders why the Americans were suddenly shooting with the accuracy of snipers. But the explanation those 4 battered crews brought back wasn't about tactics, it was about terror. Back on Rendova, the adrenaline was fading, replaced by the crushing weight of what had just happened. The sudden absence of noise was physically painful. Men stood deafened, their ears screaming with tinnitus, watching the black plumes of smoke rising from the water like tombstones. The Blanche Channel, usually a pristine blue strip separating the islands, was now a grotesque mosaic of oil slicks and floating aluminum. Marine recovery teams pushed off in small boats, not to capture prisoners, there were few of those, but to salvage intelligence. They pulled pieces of tail sections with the red Hinomaru still visible, shattered engine cowlings, and flight logs from the water. The wreckage field stretched for miles, a visible graveyard for the unbeatable Mitsubishi formation. Inside the command post of the 9th Defense Battalion, the mood wasn't celebration, it was confusion. The officers were tallying the ammunition expenditure reports from the gun batteries. The numbers didn't make sense. In the European theater, statistical analysis showed that it took an average of 2,500 rounds of heavy anti-aircraft ammunition to bring down a single bomber. It was a war of volume, not precision. You fired a cloud of steel and hoped the enemy flew into it. The report sitting on Lieutenant Colonel Shire's desk told a different story. Battery C, Evans Battery, had fired only a few dozen rounds. Across the entire battalion, the total expenditure for the engagement was 88 shells. 88 shells to destroy 12 heavy bombers. That wasn't just efficient. Mathematically, it was impossible. It represented a hit rate of nearly 14%, 7 times the expected lethality of the weapon system. When the report was radioed up the chain of command to Admiral Halsey's headquarters in the New Hebrides, the response was immediate and skeptical. Confirm kill count. Repeat. Confirm kill count. The brass at South Pacific Area Command assumed the Marines were hallucinating, or worse, lying to boost morale. No land-based unit in the history of the war had achieved a ratio like that. They demanded a recount of the wreckage. They demanded photos. But the burning evidence in the channel didn't lie. While the Americans crunched the numbers, the Japanese at Rabaul were paralyzed by them. The strategic shock was profound. For the Japanese Naval Air Service, the loss of 12 crews in 27 minutes was a catastrophe they could not absorb. These weren't rookie pilots. They were the irreplaceable veterans of the pre-war era, men with thousands of flight hours. They had been wiped out not by swarms of fighter planes, but by mudsloggers on a beach. The psychological impact was immediate. The pilots reported that the Americans had developed a new terrifying accuracy, that the flak didn't just fill the sky, but seemed to track them individually. They didn't know it was just sweat, muscle, and the removal of dead time. They assumed it was a technological leap they couldn't counter. The result was a total tactical capitulation. The Japanese commanders looked at the loss rates and made a decision that effectively ended the air battle for the Central Solomons. They stopped flying daylight raids against Rendova. They retreated to the cover of darkness, sending only sporadic, ineffective nuisance raids at night. They had ceded the sky to Evan Evans and his M1 gun. With the Type 1 lighters banished from the daylight sky, the real work of the invasion could begin. The silence on Rendova didn't last long. It was broken not by incoming bombs, but by outgoing mail. The 155mm long tom batteries, now safe from aerial destruction, peeled off their camouflage nets and elevated their massive barrels. They began a relentless, 24-hour bombardment of the Japanese positions on Munda. Without the threat of the Bettys, the artillerymen could work undisturbed, systematically pulverizing the Japanese bunkers, supply dumps, and the airfield itself. The 90mm guns had held the shield so the 155 seconds could swing the hammer. 5 weeks later, Munda airfield fell to American forces. The capture of Munda was the hinge upon which the entire Solomon Islands campaign turned. It allowed American fighters to move up the ladder, closer to Rabaul, tightening the noose around the Japanese empire. And it was all possible because on a rainy July morning, a few machinists and farmers in Marine Corps Green decided to ignore the manual, sink their pulses to their gears, and turn a defensive weapon into a sniper rifle. The vindication wasn't in the medals they didn't receive. It was in the thunder of the long toms, firing freely into the distance. The thunder of the long toms eventually faded as the front lines moved north, leaving Rendova behind in the quiet wake of the war. For the men of Battery C, victory didn't look like a parade. It looked like a pile of dirty rags used to scrub carbon fouling off the breech block. The adrenaline of July 4th washed away, replaced by the mundane, grinding reality of island hopping. There were no medals of honor awarded for the turkey shoot. In the eyes of the Marine Corps bureaucracy, Evans and his crew had simply done their job. They had fired their weapon in accordance with the general orders of a sentry. But history left a receipt. It exists today in the National Archives, catalogued as photograph 127 GW. It captures a moment of calm in the afternoon of that same day. 3 young men stand beside the gun that defied the laws of probability. On the left is Private Roy Boone. On the right, Private First Class John Gamborowski. In the center stands Evan Evans, shirtless, his face a mask of exhaustion that looks far older than 22. They aren't smiling. They are staring into the lens with the 1,000-yard stare of men who have just realized that they are mortal and that they have killed. This photograph captures more than just a gun crew. It captures the end of an era. Evans and his team didn't know it, but they were the peak of a dying breed. They were the masters of the analog war. Even as the shutter clicked on Rendova, the technology of warfare was shifting beneath their feet. In secret laboratories back in the United States, scientists were finalizing the mass production of the VT, or variable time fuse, the very technology the other stories falsely claimed Evans used. Within a year, these smart shells would arrive in force. They contained miniature radio transceivers that sent out a signal and listened for the reflection off an enemy plane, detonating automatically when they got close. The arrival of the VT fuse meant that the terrifying, muscle-straining precision of the human servo would soon be obsolete. The electronic brain would take over the job of the fuse setter. The math would be done by vacuum tubes, not by the synchronized sweat of a loader and a rammer. The dead time would be conquered by electrons, not by grit. That is what makes the feat at Rendova so singular. It stands as the high water mark of manual gunnery. It was the moment where the human component, the sheer, stubborn refusal of a machinist from Indiana to be beaten by a machine's limitations, outperformed the technology designed to replace it. Evans proved that the deadliest component in the 90mm system wasn't the high-explosive shell or the Sperry computer. It was the operator. The crew of Battery C would eventually rotate home. They would return to factories and farms in Indiana and Michigan, melting back into the civilian population they had defended. Evans went back to being a machinist, trading the 90mm breech for a lathe, living a quiet life where the only loud noises were the hum of industry, not the scream of diving Bettys. But the lesson of July 4th remained buried in the archives, a testament to the brief window where man and machine were perfectly, terrifyingly equal. It was a victory of flesh over aluminum, won just before the microchip changed the rules forever. The microchip changed the rules of engagement forever, but on July 4th, 1943, the rules were rewritten by something far more primitive, human will. When the smoke finally cleared from the Blanche Channel and the last burning pieces of Japanese aluminum sank beneath the waves, the surviving officers of the 9th Defense Battalion were left staring at a ledger that shouldn't have existed. In the cold, hard arithmetic of the Second World War, the equation for survival had always been cynical. You traded ammunition for time, and you traded blood for territory. But Evan Evans and his crew had balanced the books with 0 casualties and a stockpile of ammunition that was barely touched. The significance of the Rendova Turkey Shoot wasn't just that 12 bombers were destroyed, it was how they were destroyed. The Japanese Naval Air Service had operated on the assumption that American anti-aircraft fire was a chaotic environmental hazard, like bad weather, that could be navigated with skill and speed. They believed the dead time of the mechanical directors gave them a permanent tactical immunity. Evans shattered that immunity. By turning the gun crew into a biological servo, he proved that the dead time was not a law of physics, but a failure of discipline. The ripple effects of this realization were strategic and profound. With the airspace over Rendova sealed shut by the 90mm guns, the Japanese command at Rabaul was forced into a passive stance. They could no longer disrupt the American logistical buildup. The 155mm Long Toms continued their demolition of Munda Airfield without interruption, cracking the Japanese defensive line in the Central Solomons wide open. When Munda fell, the route to Bougainville and eventually Rabaul itself was unlocked. The island-hopping strategy, which relied on securing airfields to cover the next jump, was validated in the mud of Rendova. The 9th Defense Battalion had proved that a beachhead could defend itself against the full weight of an air fleet without needing a carrier group offshore to protect it. But for Evans, the victory was personal, not strategic. He returned to Richmond, Indiana, after the war, leaving the violence of the Pacific behind him. He didn't speak often of the day he shot down an Air Force. Like many of his generation, he viewed his service through the lens of a tradesman. He was given a job, he was given a tool, and he found a way to make the tool work better. The human servo was just a necessary improvisation, a way to keep the line moving when the machinery couldn't keep up. Today, Rendova is quiet. The jungle has reclaimed the gun pits. The mud that sucked at the boots of the Marines is covered in dense undergrowth, and the rusted remains of the Quonset huts have long since dissolved into the earth. If you walked the beach at Suicide Point now, you would hear only the wind in the palms and the gentle lap of the ocean. There is no sign of the violence, no marker for the Type 1 lighters that fell from the sky, no monument to the 88 shells that changed history. That is why we tell this story. The technology of war moves forward with a ruthless speed. We have replaced the optical director with the active radar seeker. We have replaced the hand crank with the algorithm. The skill of the individual gunner has been engineered out of the loop, rendered obsolete by systems that can think in nanoseconds. But the spirit of Battery C, the refusal to accept the impossible, the ingenuity to bridge the gap between man and machine, and the courage to stand in the open while 16 bombers try to kill you, that is timeless. Evans, Boone, and Gamborowski didn't need a smart weapon to be deadly. They just needed each other, a 3-second rhythm, and the terrifying clarity of July 4th. They remind us that in the end, the most dangerous component of any weapon system isn't the hardware. It's the human being who decides to hold the line. If you believe that the stories of men like Evan Evans deserve to be rescued from the dusty files of the National Archives, then you have a mission to complete right now. The algorithm that controls what you see next is just like that Sperry Director, it needs input. Hit that subscribe button to help us preserve the history of the old breed. Like this video to tell the system that real heroism matters more than trending topics. And in the comments below, tell us, do you think the modern push-button warfare has lost the edge that these manual gunners had, or is technology the only way to survive today? I read every single comment. Dismissed.